Tarkir Dragonstorm is going to have some legitimately format-changing cards. So I want to dive into those today. We haven't seen that many cards from the set yet, but the ones that we have seen, oh buddy, they are good. But first, how about my exclusive preview card? Hello folks, Phil Gallagher aka ThrabenU here for a deep dive strategy video on what we have seen from Tarkir Dragonstorm so far. The set is going to have an impact on even high-powered formats like Legacy and cEDH, so I want to take a look at, I think it's about 13 cards today. But first, how about my exclusive preview card, huh? When you are playing Limited in a multicolor set where you might be in 3 colors, 5 colors even, sometimes it's really important to just play 1 or 2 mana fixing cards to make it so you can actually cast all of your sweet cards. And that's where Dragon Brood's Relic comes into play. It can turn any creature you have into a mana dork, so tap an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And if you reach the endgame and you actually do have all 5 colors, you can turn it into a 4/4 dragon creature token named Reliquary Dragon that's all colors with flying, lifelink, and when this token enters, it deals 3 damage to any target. So it's a mana rock that can turn into a pretty big and maybe game-changing threat in the late game. It's gonna take some hoops to jump through, but hopefully it's good. Thank you to Wizards of the Coast for giving me the opportunity to preview this card and making me an MTG ambassador for this set. And without further ado, let's start talking about the high power cards. So let's start with Ugin, Eye of the Storms. Don't be put off by the 7 mana cost on this card. We'll talk about enabling this in a minute, but just please evaluate this based on the words on the card. Whenever you cast this spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Then, whenever you cast a colorless spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. For +2, putting this Planeswalker at a whopping 9 loyalty on the turn that it enters, you can gain 3 life and draw a card. For 0, you can add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool. And for a -11, it's weird, they didn't just write win the game on it. Instead, they wrote, search your library for any number of colorless non-land cards, exile them, then shuffle. Until end of turn, you may cast those cards without paying their mana costs. Oh, where to start? Number 1, Planeswalkers need ways to defend themselves if they are going to be good. And Ugin's defense happens before Ugin even resolves. So even if a counterspell happens, you are still getting massive value off of this card. And priority, I think, is really important here. So when Ugin does resolve, you have priority to do something with it before your opponent could target it. So you could, before anything else happens, cast, say, a 0-cost artifact spell and immediately exile a second thing before your opponent has any chance to touch Ugin. Or, if 7 mana tapped you out and you don't have free spells, you just 0 and then you cast some other reasonable card that you didn't have time to cast earlier in the game, and all of a sudden, every little mana rock that you have just turns into on cast, exile, target, permanent that's 1 or more colors. So you're not going to be hitting lands here unless you go real deep in turning lands into colored permanents, but this is incredibly defensive. So you play it, it pluses to 9, you plus the following turn, and then its -11 should win the game every single time. This card is very strong. As we saw with the Eldrazi from Modern Horizons 3, when you do things on cast so that counterspells do not interact with them, it ends up being incredibly powerful. And Stoic Mycospawn is the sort of thing that you can use to ramp into your Ugins. I said to ignore Ugin's 7 mana cost, and that's because there's a ton of ways to ramp to that quickly. Sowing Mycospawn can often obliterate some of your opponent's lands while also potentially ramping you as well. And I would not be surprised to see Planar Nexus powering up Tron lands or Cloud Posts as a way to ramp into Ugin. For players who enjoy classic artifact-based decks, this could be very strong top end for some sort of Grim Monolith Voltaic Key ramp deck. And I mean, it's not like there's a really good colorless card that we could also ramp into that gives us protection in the mid game, and then a whole bunch of cards end game that we could cast after we cast our Ugin. Yeah. So I am expecting Ugin Eye of the Storms to be a reasonable thing to be doing in Legacy. And I would not be surprised if this ends up being very, very strong in multiple formats. Don't sleep on this one. And remember, we do have tools to fight against colorless cards. You can replicate Consign to Memory in an attempt to counter both the Ugin and its triggers. Next up is Voice of Victory. Now, Legacy players, this is probably not going to make you excited, but cEDH players, this card is terrifying. This card is absolutely terrifying and messed up. Your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. I don't know, is there a cEDH staple that has something very similar written on it? Yeah, there absolutely is. The two cards are a little bit different, but I think the most important thing here is that Grand Abolisher is white as a casting cost, whereas Voice of Victory is 1 and a white. So this is a much more splashable card. This is going to be easier to cast. It's easier to accelerate into this as well, since you can use your colorless mana to pay for this cost. You don't need white. This card is going to see a lot of play, and now the decks that want that protection from Grand Abolisher have two very similar effects that they can be playing. This one's strong. Next up is Mox Jasper. Add 1 mana of any color, activate only if you control a dragon. Now, a normal person might say, that's real good in my dragon deck. Whereas I am immediately thinking, that's real good in my Changeling Outcast deck. And if you want to be playing the card Changeling Outcast for some other reason, for example, because you are using it to enable some ninja creature types and it itself is also a ninja, you could find some interesting things to be able to do with a Mox. They don't reprint the Power 9 for multiple different reasons, but every time you see one of these zero cost artifacts that can tap for a mana, you should be thinking, can I do something cool to abuse this effect? And I think Changelings are potentially the way to do that here. Next up is a pretty good card for Legacy, Rakshasa's Bargain. Let's treat this as a bug card, because let's be real, in Legacy, you're probably playing bug for this. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. Put 2 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So this is 3 mana, draw 2 cards with a little bit of selection attached to it. And that's fine. We have played cards that look like this before. I know that I've registered multiple legacy decks that are playing Sauron's Ransom, which is a relatively similar effect. It's 3 mana for some number of cards. It's a little bit variable here. 2-ish cards. But there's something that makes this one kind of broken in Legacy. While we will be paying 3 mana for this card, because it does have all of those 2 symbols in its cost as an alternate way that you can cast it if you don't have those colors, it does mean that it triggers Up the Beanstalk. So your 3 mana for 2 cards, that's already about Legacy rate, but when every copy of Up the Beanstalk you have starts giving you an additional card beyond that, this is very powerful. Operating under the assumption that perhaps sowing Mycospawn is no longer legal in Legacy in a few more days, and Up the Beanstalk control comes back, I think the control mages are gonna be eating good. Now the next one, I'm going to admit I do not know exactly what to do with it, but I think it is very powerful. Taigam Master Opportunist. So it has this flurry ability. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, copy it, and then exile the spell you cast with 4 time counters on it. If it doesn't have Suspend, it gains Suspend. So a few turns later, you're going to get, I would normally say a copy, but it's actually the original version, as you are copying your original spell. So you resolve the copy on the turn that you cast that second spell, and then when those 4 time counters are gone, you get your original back as well. I think this flurry ability is pretty pushed. This specific card does not have any sort of evasion attached to it, so it's not like this is a hyper aggressive card. This is a pretty normal sized body, but copying spells is really good. This is something that you can play out in the early game. And notice here that this says your second spell each turn. It doesn't say non-creature spell. It just says spell. So you could be copying creatures, getting a token immediately and the real thing later. And when this comes off of suspend, that's your first spell per turn, right? And you're not paying any mana for that one. And then whatever spell you actually cast with your mana, then that is going to be your second spell for turn that is going to be copied. And I think you see where this is going. If you then stack up multiple cards with Flurry, and you maybe trigger Flurry 2 or 3 times per turn, you could be seriously cooking. This is a card that I think we're going to need to see what the other Flurry cards look like before we fully evaluate this one. But within the context of Legacy, it is so easy to cast 2 spells per turn. You have to do very, very little to pay this off. And when you have a bunch of generically good cards, think your Swords to Plowshares, your Ponders, your Brainstorms, all that sort of stuff, you can probably do something with them no matter when those are cast. Keep an eye on this one. This one's probably going places. Next up is Strategic Betrayal, and I am very, very excited about this card. This is a very strange removal spell, as it does not actually target a creature. It targets an opponent. So target opponent exiles a creature they control, meaning that they choose, and their graveyard. So thing number one to understand about this card is that this is a bad removal spell. This is a sorcery. And your opponent gets to exile their worst creature, whatever creature benefits them the least. So in terms of being a removal spell, this is not excited. But this sure is in my video about powerful cards from the set now, isn't it? The fact that this simultaneously answers 2 problems is a really, really big deal. Recent Magic sets have had a focus on graveyard-oriented value. And it varies a little bit from format to format, but most decks dip into their graveyard for some degree of value. And the Titans like Flage and Uro are a great example of this. If you cast Strategic Betrayal and you get rid of some creature in the graveyard while also exiling a Flage or an Uro, that's a really, really big deal. And I can't overstate enough how good it is to clear out the graveyard. You have all of your Life from the Loams, your Murktide Regents, your various Tarmogoyf-style cards that care about the number of different card types in graveyards. Dragon's Rage Channeler that becomes a 3/3 if they have enough stuff in graveyard. Having a removal spell that can just coincidentally also take out the graveyard with it is really strong. Many Legacy decks right now are main decking things like Nihil Spellbomb, because main deck graveyard hate is just necessary in the format right now, with powerful Reanimator decks being all over the place, with Oops All Spells being something that is strong in the format. Delver is Delver, it's always popular. So if you have a card that is perfectly reasonable to cast to get rid of a creature of some kind, and also wipes out a very important zone, this is good. From format to format, this may vary. This might be something that you might main deck in Standard. This might be something you play as a sideboard card in Legacy. For mono black decks that are already sort of incidentally hating on the graveyard, maybe with things like Boggart Trawler or Douthie Voidwalker, this can help you just have a little bit more access to hating on the graveyard. This card is really cool, and I expect to be slotting this into a handful of Legacy decks. I've got a couple of cards I want to lightly touch on now. We're going to move a little faster. I think the ones that I've covered so far are the most important ones that have been spoiled thus far. Get down in the comments below if I have missed something. I do want to know. I really just love cards that look like this. Karsi, question mark on the pronunciation there. Karsi Revenant is another Vampire Nighthawk style card, and I have loved these. I have played a couple of leagues with Vampire Nighthawk in Legacy, and it was really fun every time. And this is a Vampire Nighthawk that can kind of come back. After this dies, you can renew it from your graveyard to put a flying counter, a death touch counter, and a lifelink counter on target creature at sorcery speed. So this is annoying the first time around, and then it comes back and gives its powers to something else. This is awesome. Next up is cEDH Regent of the Mire. Cards that look like this often end up being busted. Think your birthing pods. You can sacrifice a creature you control with mana value X other than cEDH. You return target creature with mana value X+1 from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. Again, I was just talking about the graveyard as a powerful zoned, and if your graveyard is operating as sort of a second hand, maybe you have some way to do a little bit of self-mill, you can keep bringing back your powerful creatures. Note that this is not an X+1 or less, it is literally an X+1. So I think this one is not busted. I think this is just a reasonable Magic the Gathering card. But it is very, very easy to be wrong about these sorts of things. Stormscale Ion! This is one that people have talked about already, so I'm not going to linger here. But this is just a dragon with the literal word storm written on it. And note that in Legacy Mono Red Storm decks, this is very, very reasonable to do after something like a Seething Song. So I would not be surprised if occasionally you will see this out of something like a Ruby Storm deck. They do have the generic Wish card that can wish for anything. And these dragons get big quickly. It does not take a very large storm count to kill your opponents here. Baby Siege Rhino doot to doot to doot. This card is sweet. Absolutely not legacy playable in any capacity, but I absolutely love the callback that we are seeing here. And I want to close out this segment by just saying that the fetch lands have been reprinted in this set with beautiful alternate art. So if you are the collector or you care about the bling in your deck, take a look at this entire cycle if you haven't seen them already. They are hot. So I am really excited about this set. Obviously, I'm a little biased. I'm an MTG ambassador for this set. I got a preview card to this set, so this set has some personal meaning to me. But I think the cards in this set are really sweet. This seems like it is going to be a high-powered standard legal set. And I think we're going to see quite a few cards trickle through into Eternal formats. And folks, should you need those cards, please consider checking out my sponsor, TOAMagic.com. Promo code ThrabenU will save you 5% on your order, and you always get fast, free shipping. So whether it's some fetch lands or a broken 7-mana colorless card, they'll probably have it for you. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day, and consider following me on moxfield.com as well. They're another one of my sponsors, and I will be putting up all sorts of deck lists brewing around these new cards in the coming weeks. All right, get out there, get brewing, and if you have any cards that I missed, throw them down there in the comments, and I'd be happy to talk about them. See ya!